I rag on PacMan for the Atari 2600 because it's an unlovable, flickering, quality-resistant
mockery of a sham, a mockery of a travesty of two mockeries of a sham.
The kind of game that if you got this for Christmas in the early 80s, you cram it into the cartridge slot, you turn it on, you're exposed to what would later be described by the AVU, the Atari Victims Unit, as an epileptic's death sentence. So yeah, clearly not all arcade ports of games back then hit the mark. In fact, most fell terribly short. But as home gaming console power increased to the mid-80s,
the Nintendo Entertainment System. Now you're playing with power.
The comparison between arcade and home began to blur. Kids everywhere began to trust the process again and could open Christmas gifts without the overwhelming sense of dread and crippling anxiety that the Intellivision and Atari years had introduced. While some game companies strived to deliver the arcade experience of their coin-op hits, others made the decision to keep the name, but change the game. On today's episode of We Have This Game at Home, we look at the Nintendo Entertainment System ports of arcade royalty that changed the game for the better, and in some cases, for the worst. Capcom's Bionic Commando hit arcades in 1988 and was a sleeper hit due to its interesting no-jump mechanic, which had players entirely relying on the hero's bionic arm for locomotion to traverse the increasingly chaotic levels. Capcom's decision to pay homage to the coin-op, as well as Commando, but flesh out the story, tighten the controls, and ramp up the difficulty, is the reason why Bionic Commando shows up on Best of NES year after year. Oh, and a 33-year-old spoiler alert, how many games feature the exploding head of a cloned Adolf Hitler? Okay, like besides Barbie's Nazi Adventure. It's probably safe to say most of us older gamers played just enough Contra in the arcade to get us pumped for a home version, which we gobbled up when it arrived on the NES in 1988. And that's where most of us remember this game from due to the hours dedicated to its award-winning two-player frenetic gameplay. Not only was it a tighter game experience overall in the NES, but it spawned that infamous Konami code. While you might think this game is an exact replica of the arcade version, the level structures were combined and changed just enough to warrant Contra being on this list. No doubt, Ninja Gaiden was a fun arcade beat-em-up that ate quarters like mad in the 80s. The violent continuous scenes alone were the stuff of nightmares back then. And if I'm being honest, I was a little dismayed at first that Tecmo's NES port was different from the mindless arcade gameplay. But I soon realized that Tecmo went above and beyond with intense gameplay and platform challenges that made the coin-op look easy by comparison. It's no wonder NG spawned two more excellent sequels on the NES. Capcom must have looked at the architecture of the NES and said, well, we can't do a straight port, so let's do this instead, and created an entirely new game for the home console. In truth, though, at the time, Strider on the NES follows closely to the source material it was based on, the Strider Huryu manga that was written at that time. Those looking for a note-for-note port of the arcade game would have to wait for the awesome Genesis version. But NES players received this quirky and extremely tough little gem, somewhat Metroidvania-like in its level structure and challenging as heck. Strider on the NES was completely different, but satisfying and a lot of fun. Hey, and thanks for that password feature. I remember Punch-Out being a very fun game in the arcades in the early 80s, and definitely a cool-looking one with its dual-screen presence. I wasn't very good at it, though. But many years later, it appeared on the NES under a new name, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, featuring, of course, Iron Mike. What Nintendo did with the Punch-Out NES game is nothing short of a coding miracle, featuring spot-on controls, a slew of familiar and new opponents, and large cartoony sprites made this home version of Punch-Out arguably more fun and engaging than its arcade counterpart. Plus, it had a password feature and Mike Tyson, who I've actually never beaten. At this point, I'd rather take on the real Mike. Probably not. Tengen, what didn't they do right back then? I'm not going to get into it here, but Tengen released some incredible ports of arcade titles that blew away the officially licensed ports on the NES. Most were arcade perfect, but Miss PacMan gets the nod here for not only looking like the arcade game in terms of colors that the official Namco port gets wrong, but for adding customization to the NES version. You can choose your game style, the difficulty, your maze configuration, whether you want a pack booster like a speed boost, and your level select as well. It is above and beyond any version of Miss PacMan available, I'd say even including the arcade version. Track and field, the button-mashing Olympics. I'm almost positive we're not that far off from that becoming a reality any day now. Konami's track and field was a blast squaring off against your opponent at your local arcade. And while the arcade version featured 6 events, the NES port throws in 2 more, but really there are 3 new events as one of the arcade events was replaced. The graphics are fantastic and look almost identical to the arcade. Where the home port does take a hit though, is in the inexplicable decision by Konami to only allow 1 run button, while the arcade allowed 2. The button just sits there. But anyway, it's still fun, and thanks to the extra events, is a must-play over the arcade. And a side note, I was amazed in the early 80s when I first heard the Chariots of Fire theme playing at the high score screen. Bomb Jack. This one will be quite a polarizing choice, I'm sure. Some of you will be, and some of you will be. First, the good news. The Bomb Jack gameplay that you loved in the arcades is in this game. It's just a little buried, and you have to go through some platforming hell to get at it. Instead of the arcade's vertical level-by-level gameplay diffusing bombs, the NES port is a side-scrolling adventure featuring almost like AI-level enemies hell-bent on destroying your nerves and your self-esteem. Some people call it tough, others call it broken. I kind of call it a bait and switch because I bought this game thinking it was Bomb Jack, and it kind of, sort of was, but yet not. If you don't know who Cody, Guy, and Hagar are by 2023, well, I'm not sure you're watching the right video. The characters debuted in the original arcade Final Fight back in '89, which was a 2-player side-scrolling beat-em-up a la, Double Dragon. Final Fight was a coin-up smash hit and was only a matter of time before it appeared on the home consoles, and sure enough, Final Fight for the Super Nintendo was released in 1991. Mighty Final Fight released in '93 on the NES and took the best parts of the FF franchise, added some XP upgrade elements, and scrunched it down into an action-packed but peewee-sized satirical single-player NES game. All 3 players were available to play, and the upgrading moves feature enabled players to have enough punching power to make it through to the end. Definite classic. And while we're on the subject of Mighty Final Fight, extra bonus. Anyone remember Street Fighter 2010, The Final Fight? This punishingly difficult action game was branded arcade-inspired by Capcom themselves. But was it based on Street Fighter or Final Fight? While it played like neither game, the main character was, in fact, Ken from the original Street Fighter arcade game 25 years in the future. Toss in a convoluted plot about Ken going to university, studying cybotics, a dead friend named Troy, the ability to world jump, and fighting bad guys called parasites, and well, there's your backstory. Now go and beat everyone up, like you need an excuse. You either loved this one, hated it, or didn't touch it because you knew something was up with that title. So far, we've looked at the NES arcade ports that strive to be different and succeeded for the most part. Here's a few that definitely missed the target. Captain America and the Avengers. When Data East released their 4-player superhero arcade extravaganza in 1991, arcade gamers were excited to play as these classic Marvel characters, even though Captain America, Iron Man, Vision, and Hawkeye didn't have the same cachet as they do now. Coins were flying like punches as friends and strangers alike put their powers together to defeat the Red Skull. When Data East ported this instant arcade classic to the NES, it did so by reducing the fun factor to 25%, as it was a single-player only affair and sadly only featured Cap and Hawkeye, boo and hiss. The game was repetitive, graphically bland, and just all kinds of meh for a game based on superheroes. Looks like the Red Skull won this battle, Cap. Oh, and Hawkeye, too. Dragon's Lair. Rick Dyer and Don Bluth's Dragon's Lair was an instant classic when it showed up in arcades in '83. It already knew it was the big man on campus and established its coin-op dominance by charging double the admission price at 50 cents a play. A playable fantasy cartoon adventure animated by an ex-Disney animator? I mean, it writes itself. And it actually almost plays itself, too. So how could that winning combination go wrong? Well, by trying to change the gameplay entirely into a side-scrolling adventure style and jamming it all into an NES. Dragon's Lair is by no means unplayable, but it is clunky, unfun, infuriating, and nothing like the coin-op. The box art, now that sure was great, almost too great. In fact, it's not misleading exactly, but it's not misleading either. And last, and certainly least, Karate Champ. Without Data East's killer fighting karate game released back in '86, chances are we'd never know Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, Fatal Fury, and the slew of Me Too fighting games we have today. Requiring 2 joysticks per player and no buttons, the controls were surprisingly deep, and you could always come back from certain defeat with some well-executed moves. Well, how do you ruin that winning combination? By porting it to the NES, making it look and sound identical, which is impressive, but then forcing a convoluted control scheme of 19 moves onto 2 buttons in 4 directions, which means there is no chance you'll ever pull off a move that you intend to in the heat of battle. If you spent good money on this, back in the day, I'm going to say it, you were definitely a karate chump. Well, that's it for another episode of We Have This Game at Home. Thank you so much for watching. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below. I'm going to catch up on some Bionic Commando on the NES. And remember, if you aren't retro gaming, what are you doing? I'll see you next time, friends.
A winner is you. Productions.